On behalf of Team SDPI, I welcome you all to this seminar regarding Pakistan's economy and debt challenges. Today's discussion is an opportunity to see where the economy of Pakistan currently stands and what options does the government have in order to address these challenges it faces with regards to its debt situation currently. So before I proceed, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. I'd request all speakers to please keep their microphones off when they're not speaking to ensure good quality audio for everyone. Speakers are also encouraged to switch on their cameras, especially when they're speaking, if their network allows them to do so without any disruptions. If all panelists are comfortable, the meeting will be recorded and we are going live on our social media platforms as well. We welcome you to revisit this discussion later on our social media pages and feel free to share with your network as well. We also invite questions and comments from our esteemed audience in the chat box on the right side of the window. We encourage you all to please feel free to speak in Urdu and English, whatever medium you're comfortable with. And I, as moderator, will prompt my esteemed panelists once we're pressed on time. So moving on, I'm just very grateful to all my esteemed panelists who have joined us and all my participants as well who joined us in person and online. I'd like to briefly introduce everyone with my panel before I invite all of them to come in with their interventions. So we have Dr. Abid Suwaidi, who is the Executive Director of Sustainable Development Policy Institute. We have Dr. Waqar Ahmed, who is Joint Executive Director at SDPI. We have Mr. Ali Khizr. Ali Khizr Saab is Head of Research at the Business Recorder. Dr. Aqdas Afzal has also joined us, and he's Assistant Professor and Program Director, Social Development and Policy Program at Habib University. I thank you all for taking out time for this session today, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. So the structure of this session is going to be that perhaps we'll have round one of questions. I'll ask all my speakers a couple of questions and then we'll move on to round two as well. So perhaps Dr. Abid, I can start with you. As we all know that Pakistan has faced several macroeconomic vulnerabilities in 2022 and the economy has entered 2023 amidst even more uncertainty than before. And to top it all off, the geopolitical challenges that we are seeing around us have also exacerbated these challenges for all countries alike, not just for Pakistan, but of course Pakistan as well. So bearing all of this in mind, what options does the government have currently? To shed light on that.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'll thank Ali Khizr and Aqdas Afzal both for joining us online, and thanks colleagues for organizing it. Today we wanted to discuss the economic turmoil that Pakistan is in. What are the options, especially with the debt and the current political situation. And the word which is being used for the current turmoil that the world is facing is perma-crisis. That world is in continuously facing one or another crisis. So it's a permanent crisis that the world is in for the last couple of years due to COVID first, and then due to the war of Ukraine, Russia's invasion on Ukraine. Now, if I just quickly check some of the numbers, region-wise number. In Latin America, for example, you can see that Argentina, it has inflation of 94.8%. Then if one comes to Europe and Caucasus, Turkey, it's facing an inflation of 64.3%. If one looks at Middle East and North Africa, Egypt, it's facing an inflation of 21.3%. And in our region, Pakistan is facing an inflation of 24.5%. Similarly, I looked at the currency, how the currencies are doing vis-a-vis dollars. Argentina lost 42% during the last 1 year. Turkey has lost 27.4%. Egypt has lost 46.9%. Eurozone has lost 4.5%. Great Britain has lost 8.6%. Pakistan has lost 23.1% and is expected to lose further. So this is the macro picture. But then, of course, Pakistan was also affected by floods that made the situation further difficult. And I call them triple C crisis, COVID, conflict, and climate change. But then in our case, there is a fourth C as well. So it's a tetra C crisis, and that is complacency. I must say that we remain complacent to the first three C crisis, and I'm referring to political instability. The political instability that also aggravated the situation. So we are for last 1 year now in a situation where political instability that is haunting our economic stability, and then politics is done on that economic stability, and that further increases political instability. So we are in sort of vicious cycle. Now, Pakistan till today has averted a sovereign default, not because of our health of our economy, but because of our foreign policy. So if we owe 30% to China, 20% to Saudi Arabia, another 10% to UAE and Qatar, which makes up 60%, and then an additional 10% to IMF and the Paris Club, for which we need to remain politically correct with America and Western world. So because we were able to somehow maintain balance in our foreign policy among these geoeconomic and geopolitical forces, we didn't default. We were on the brink of default, but we managed to somehow sail smooth. But now going forward, when one looks at the options, I think the first and foremost option is to be with the IMF. We need all three. So we cannot have China or Saudi Arabia or IMF. We need to have China and Saudi Arabia and IMF and Europe and all others. And we have to start with the IMF because now even rollovers and support from friendly countries, that is now conditional to IMF review, ninth review. We have to be with it, and we have to be politically correct with the Western world. And once we are there, we need to then look at the political compulsions. I think, of course, for any government which have to now face two provincial assemblies elections, it would be extremely difficult to follow IMF program. That would be at the cost of its political capital. But if it doesn't do it, we, unfortunately, God forbid, will be in the same position as the Sri Lanka was a year ago, which means we will be left with no dollars to import petroleum product, to import medicines, to import fertilizer, to import food product, to import cooking oil. And we have seen it happening in case of Sri Lanka. So, of course, the only option now with the government is to either to keep on taking popular decision as Sri Lanka did, and then face the consequences, or to sacrifice its political capital and take some of the tough measures, which has already casted negatively on government's political capital, and would further erode its political capital, especially when it comes to the elections of Punjab Assembly and KP Assembly. But my concluding note is, and I think now is perhaps a time where all these political forces, they need to understand that IMF is a must. We can't keep on simply commending IMF for its tough conditionalities. We can't keep on condemning IMF for its tough conditionalities when each political party, they know that they have to go there. But the choice, your political capital vis-a-vis taking some non-popular decisions, I think that is now very visible, quite important. And I think we need to support the government today. Many of the decisions that government need to take, and it should take, even it should have taken yesterday. For example, this increase in PDL and now bringing the central bank rate equal to the open market rate, or thinking of some of the how to meet this revenue deficit, etc. I think we need to support the government with the one additional thing that government need to do is to strengthen the social protection so that the poorest among of the poor and lower middle income segment of society, those can be protected. But I'm quite clear, and STPI is quite clear that not going to IMF would have more negative implications right now than going to IMF.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abid. And absolutely, I agree with you that all stakeholders of the public and private sector need to show a united front at this point in order to be able to face all these challenges, lest we become like Sri Lanka, God forbid. So thank you very much for that, sir. Moving on, I'd like to request Ali Khizr Saab. Sir, what does Pakistan owe and to whom? And also, can you shed light on what are the liabilities for us for the next year and for the next 3 years as well, sir?
Oh, well, the situation is not good, as we all know that the country reserves are down to a very low level, and we have a ballooning repayment, so we have a crisis to repay our external debt. And that's a very legitimate and real crisis, and that can lead to any kind of a default. So, the state bank reserves are about 4.6 billion as the latest data, and you have more than that amount of debt repayment in the next two months. And if you don't go to the IMF, apart from China, where some rollovers are possible, there is no other new debt is actually coming to Pakistan. Nothing from Saudi Arabia or UAE, as we can see that.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's some volume issue. If you can speak up a little bit.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Is it better? Yes. So thank you. Well, so what we need to do is we need to go to the IMF, and without it, the situation would be going to be worse anyways. I just give you some context of what is happening in the past 12 months or so. I mean, your reserves were about 16.5 billion in January 2022, and now you're about 4.6. So that's a decline of 12 billion. And so from July onward, when we saw that the reserves are falling, and at that time, prior to the 7th, 8th review of the IMF, there was no recourse, and the country was not ready for political reasons, for A reason or B reasons. So without going into one political party or the other, but the country political actors were not able to make the right decision of the conservation of energy and shortening of the week and curtailing imports organically throughout the economy. So the State Bank and the Minister of Finance at that point, Mr. Ismail Waziir, they were forced to do some kind of LCs restriction. They started with Chapter 84 and 85 LCs restrictions, where they allowed the quota of 50% monthly import based on the last year average monthly import. So that was happening to automobile and many other engineering related. So that was supposed to end in September. We went into the IMF review, 7th, 8th review, but again the 9th review got stuck, and we couldn't revive it. And this is the restriction was restriction continued. And in January, and then a State Bank was imposing informal, impositions on banks that what they should import, what they not import. And in January, they ended that restriction formally to a circular with given a priority to different sectors than that. But at the same time, the State Bank was giving banks a little less to import. And what's happening today, they're not importing the raw material. Even the LCs of your petroleum products and food items are being questioned now. Now, one by one, every industry is falling. So you are employing a default on your private sector commitments. And not to mention that for the past many months, that for foreigners who have to take their dividend out, the foreign companies operating in Pakistan, when they take the dividend out, or when someone like Abid Saveri is sending money to his son working studying abroad, he's not being able to send back. So all those kind of defaults are already happening, and they are being pending. And now we are restricted to import the basic things. And the things go that way. We have a massive shortages, and due to that inflation and high load shedding, and you may have rationing of the petroleum products and everything that's happening. So you're choking the economy, which is import dependent. You're not working on the structure reforms. You're not working on the broad-based savings, but your political consideration for A reason or the B reason are paramount, and you are killing the economy the way it is. So that's my fear. That's what is happening. And whatever you called it, like we have averted a default or not, we may have averted a sovereign default on our euro bond, and we may avert payment on the commercial repayment. But yes, but we are defaulting to this country. So that's something we need to accept that before we move forward. And what we need to do is we don't have a much of choice. That we don't have any buffer left in our economy. We need to get back to the IMF program. We need to work on the structural reforms, ASAP, and we need to really work on those structures, which I didn't see that structural reforms happening in this government, previous government, the government prior to that. And in my career of about 20 years, I haven't seen anyone really working on that. There was spurt of growth, and those structural imbalances were not, change, and you let that inflows to turn into a consumption-led growth, and the country has 90% plus consumption. The country has under 10% of export to GDP. If you include the export of goods and services, this is not sustainable, and that is coming to an halt. Unless we change it, the world is not ready to accept that. This country rely on the geopolitical rent for the past 70, 75 years. Those rents are being dried out. The country relied on the friendly supports, as Abhichari mentioned, that we XP, DCB, all the support that. But we clearly see that what the Saudi Arabian finance minister said lately at Davos. He said that the country is who are a perpetual need of those inflows, and we'll be providing them unconditional deposit to stop doing that. It's our taxpayer money, and we'd like them to do some kind of a reforms, and we'll have talked and linked to this multilaterals, i.e. IMF and World Bank. So that is that we don't see much support from Saudi Arabia coming to Pakistan, as there were 3-4 countries he was referring to that, and Pakistan is one of that country. And I don't see any other support coming from any other Middle Eastern country, and on that. China may give you some support, but that won't be enough. That won't be enough. You have to work on that. You have a problem. You have a problem of elongated debt repayment. You have 25 billion debt repayment next year, and similar amount of that. It's about 10 billion or so. The rollover, if you take that out, 25, 15 billion amount. We need to change those loans into 5 years or 7 years. We need to do the elongation of the payment. We need to buy that time, and we need to do the reforms. And once the world would see our reforms, and then pour in the investment, as no investment is coming into Pakistan. So that structure has to change, and this has to work on that. Otherwise, this country is going through a very forced default, and I fear that situation like Sri Lanka will emerge in Pakistan pretty soon if we don't act. So this is where how I start with, and I like to come back on it before other people like to say add on.
Yes, Ali Khizr Sahab, thank you very much. Moving on, Dr. Akhtar Afzal, perhaps I can request you to answer that. We're currently facing high levels of debt servicing. So, what pressures do you see on our exchange rate and the inflation as well?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important discussion. I was listening very carefully to the remarks being presented by panelists who have just spoken, Dr. Abid Suleri and then Ali Khizr. And so your question is specific, but before I answer your question, I would just like to take you back only, a few months, slightly more than a year, October 2021, when Pakistan was enjoying one of the highest amount of foreign exchange reserves that we had ever been able to accumulate at $22 billion. And everything seemed to be going along smoothly, whereas the State Bank of Pakistan was also talking about forward guidance. You may remember that. January, February onwards, once these hostilities began between Russia and Ukraine, we have seen the world economy take a turn for the worse. And this has been deeply impacted by the geopolitical developments. As a matter of fact, right now, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves have plummeted to less than $5 billion, creating a very anxious situation for many Pakistanis. I believe that in the months to come, there is going to be continued pressure because of debt servicing requirements on the Pakistan exchange rate. And mind you, that requirements being given to you by the IMF that they are required to. So I think in the months to come, we are going to see a significant decline in our exchange rate. And that significant decline in Pakistan's exchange rate is then going to start another round of inflationary pressures in the Pakistani economy, which is already at 25%. So I think the months to come are going to be very, very difficult. But in all of this, I would like to say that I would like Pakistani policymakers to focus on the most vulnerable sections of society. And this is the point that was raised by Dr. Abid Suleri. And in this, I would like to specifically say that I would like to see this government increase Benazir income support program stipends, increase its, and also these stipends with the sensitive price index or the CPI in order to insulate the most vulnerable sections of society from inflation. And Mr. Ali said about the lack of reasons, or one of the ways in which we can ensure that sustainable reform is started in Pakistan is by taking care of the most vulnerable. And I think only by doing this, you can decrease resistance to reforms, because whenever these reforms or structural reforms take place, a lot of people in the most vulnerable sections of society are going to get impacted. So I think these are 2 or 3 things that I would like to say specifically about the question you asked. But I also think that when we talk about reforms, there are 2 specific reforms that I would like to suggest. And the first one has to do with tax reforms. Of course, we haven't been able to do much when it comes to increasing there are no tangible outcomes or objectives that we have been able to achieve despite talking about tax reforms for a very long time. So I think that's one area of reforms that we must focus on. And the other area of reforms has to do with export competitiveness. And for this, we are going to have to undertake some reforms in our tariff structure. And this, again, I'm referring to the World Bank study done by Gonzalo Varela, which a lot of people like to quote, because right now we are suffering from a lot of para-tariffs, disguised duties, which basically create a very easy things for manufacturers and industrialists. And so they don't feel the pressure to have an export orientation. So I think in insulating our local producers and manufacturers, we are actually working at cross purposes when it comes to increasing our exports is concerned. So I think that's another area we are going to have to look at. I think in the final analysis, I believe that Pakistan is going to be able to, Pakistan and IMF's negotiations are going to be successful. And just today, I read in Dawn that the government has officially declared that it's ready to accept all the demands that the IMF had put on the table. So I think that that's going to be successful. Immediate danger is going to be averted, but I think we are not going to be out of the woods, at least for another 2 to 3 years. And that is only going to be, those dangers are only going to be averted if we are able to sustain permanent reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Akhtar Saab. Absolutely. I think our underprivileged part of our society really does bear the brunt of our problems that are arising due to inflation. And a recent example of that is the flour crisis, and how this video was circulating on social media of how this stampede occurred and a man died because of that while he was trying to get flour for his 6 children and his household, basically. So absolutely, and the government has agreed to how it needs to accept all these negotiations and come to the table. But of course, we'll be addressing that further in the second round as well. I'd like to move on to Dr. Waqar now, and sir, I would like to ask you that, keeping all of this in mind, the discussion that has happened, how do you think the government needs to plan and restructure and sequence the restructuring of debt? And which lenders do you think are willing to engage with Pakistan on this rollover, this reprofiling and the restructuring of the debts that we have currently?
Thank you, Mahnoor. And full disclosure that I'm standing in for my colleague, Dr. Sajid Amin, who was busy today. I think a large part of the question which you have posed, it's addressed when we look at it in the context of political stability. The fact that those who lend to Pakistan want to see a certain level of political stability. They want to be sure that there will be people at the helm of affairs who would put in place measures which allow for repayment of whatever they have lent to Pakistan. Only then, of course, they engage in medium to longer term support to the country. Currently, of course, the support which is being negotiated is of a very, very myopic or a short tenor support, as you could say. So I think it's important to point out, and now that I come at the end of the panel, and before you go back for a second round, I have this advantage of maybe picking up from what other esteemed colleagues have suggested. So I think the single point, we talk about the Charter of Economy, the single point Charter of Economy is don't walk away from whatever you've signed with IMF, right? And I'm glad that this government is really walking that line, and the government has said this categorically that they will honor all their commitments with the fund, which is good, and certainly provides a lot of solace to those who want to help us out, including those countries which have recently rolled over their maturing debts. That's one. Second is that we need to help ourselves. I believe that we received decent pledges in the Geneva meeting, and realization of those pledges should ease at least some months, or should unlock some months of forex that this country really requires. Of course, both are different problems. Flood is a different issue. The chronic BOP problem is a different issue. Debt accumulation is a third issue. But having said this, of course, and Finance Minister has been on record, that whenever a country receives foreign exchange, it has at least that level of flexibility that it can utilize it in times of emergency. But as I said, we need to help ourselves. So if the pledges are there, we now need to demonstrate good PFM structures, good public finance management structures. We need to inform our donors that this money is ready for deployment, which is what they are aiming for. We should be quick in packaging the PC1s that are now required to access this funding, so that some, of course, forex is unlocked within this quarter. Having said this, I believe that an early understanding with IMF this month, and probably finalization of the review, should in itself release at least should unlock 2 to 2.5 billion US dollars, which should take you through the next quarter. And once you cross the next quarter, the quarter after that, you are already looking into requesting the fund for the next program, which is after June. So if you're able to complete this program by the mid-year in a strong manner, demonstrate good fiscal responsibility, good fiscal consolidation, you would be going into, or at least requesting the IMF board for the next fund program on a moral high, basically. And then what you do is that once you enter into the negotiations and there's a tacit approval by the fund that, yes, we will be considering Pakistan for the next facility, and Pakistan has shown responsible policies and policy implementation, you then somewhere around July or August, you have this possibility, or you could have this opportunity to go back to the bond market. And you could probably raise some money through the bond market only, of course, fingers crossed, it's a big if, but only if you're able to get good worthiness, as we call it. But of course, apart from the bond market, your swaps get revised. You can request for higher amounts of swaps. Then, of course, you could also approach something which the central bank was considering, but it was going back to the diaspora, something which we had done during the COVID days. We cannot do now, of course. We certainly need to restore their confidence first. But we can do that post July or August going forward. Having said this, while I'm confident that the review will be completed very soon, and the mission will also be expedited, I am also confident that the Friends of Pakistan will, of course, also deliver on their promises. We have seen their statements as well. I think in the medium term, you would be left with a much higher accumulated debt. And that has its own welfare implications. That has its own intergenerational impacts, of course, which we need to be mindful about. We should not just be talking about the short term, we should be talking about the long term as well. So in that respect, I think I would like to go back to the staff report of the IMF, where IMF has itself suggested that while, of course, Pakistan is seeking higher levels of debt, not just to retire the previous debt, but of course to meet the CAD requirements of future as well and repayment requirements of future as well, it requires much robust debt management institutional structure on ground. And in that respect, I think this will also give confidence to the bilateral lenders as well. And if one looks at that report and when we talk with the mission, there are two levels of institutional improvements which are required when it comes to management of debt. The short-term custodian or the institution that calls for the short-term sort of shots on the debt is the finance ministry. It's the debt coordination office that needs to be strengthened for short-term debt. Now, the longer-term debt, the program lending, is done by Economic Affairs Division. In both areas, we require much more improvements. Currently, due to, of course, our haste in getting dollars, we sometimes end up signing program loans which may be a duplication. They may have overlaps. We may not need that loan. We may have a lot of loans for that sector, but we still take it because we need dollars. So it goes back to the debt coordination architecture that we need to improve in the Economic Affairs Division. And this should give a lot of confidence to our leaders going forward. I also feel that I think Dr. Abid touched on this, I think it's time that we will have to demonstrate not just to the IMF, but also to the domestic market agents, to your domestic markets as well, that yes, we will move towards the true value of dollar, basically. And whatever the market determined exchange rate is, we should gradually start coming closer to it. So what our colleagues in the banking sector, in the money exchange companies are informing us is that one of the reasons that remittances are seeing a hit and remittances are declining is because those who are sending the remittances are clearly seeing that wedge widening, where they have an incentive to send via Hawala than to send via the formal interbank rate. So the faster you go over there, that has its dividend on the CAD side, the current account deficit side as well. And moving towards the market determined exchange rate would also automatically regulate a part of your energy demand as well. At least the private sector's manufacturing sector's demand maybe, it gets regulated, because as the cost gets higher, your longer term or medium term demand orders that they place for their oil supplies get automatically regulated. You don't need to come in and be the bad cop that I'm curtailing the supplies or inputs in any manner. On your sequencing question, I had some suggestions on the fiscal consolidation part, but I will save those. But because I do see people on social media who are following us live stream, we also need to see that there is an opportunity in every crisis. And the opportunity in the crisis in which we are passing from today is for those exporters who will be able to pivot. Your rupee in the next few days may weaken further before it starts to improve, maybe around the next quarter or so. This weakening rupee is an opportunity for those exporters who can pivot, those who can make innovative use of local inputs and local raw materials. And I'm not just talking about exporters of merchandise, exporters of goods. This is an opportunity for exporters of services. If your services sector exporters, you've already seen over 5 to 6 billion of ICT exports last year. And given the fact that those institutions have the same cost envelope this year as well, or even if it increases, it hasn't increased probably in dollar terms, living inside Pakistan, we are supplying those services, which of course have relatively become more favorably competitive abroad. And this is, and exports is just one example. I am certain there are more opportunities in crisis. It's just that we haven't started a debate on what are those opportunities in this crisis.
Thank you very much, sir. Absolutely. Market determined exchange rate is the answer to all our woes currently. And yes, this is an opportunity. This challenge is an opportunity for the exporter here. And we hope to open up this debate through the discussion that we're having today. Sir, I'd like to pick up something that you mentioned, that there are friends who are pledging funds to Pakistan currently. It's the need of the hour. So Dr. Abid, I'd like to move to you now, and perhaps you can shed light on what those, whoever the banks and the countries that have offered pledges to us, if you could let us know about them a bit, and also how do you think we need to smartly make use of these in order to address all the challenges that we are facing in this economic turmoil?
Well, first thing first, I don't see these pledges helping us in bridging our budgetary requirement. So it would be a project financing. So we cannot actually rely on those pledges to shore up our foreign exchange reserves. The second thing is that this is at least for the fourth time in recent history, in last 20 years, that Pakistan is going to international community. 2005 during earthquake, 2009 during Friends of Democratic Pakistan, 2010 during those floods, and now 22 the floods. And if one look at the previous three donor pledges, half of them they don't get materialized. Almost one quarter they are rebranding and repackaging of the existing initiatives. They are grants, they are soft loans, they are loans, or a combination of all three are in-kind assistance. This time, I think the way forward should be that government, I don't see a vehicle in government where these projects can be parked. NDRMF has the potential, National Disaster Risk Management Fund. NDRMF should do a follow-up, and it is fortunately housed by in the Ministry of Planning and Development. NDRMF and Ministry of Planning and Development, they should do a follow-up of Geneva Conference, and they should come up with some tangible project proposals so that those who have pledged, they can actually start offering their money. If we will not submit doable projects, we will not receive the money. On another note, which I wanted to say about IMF, I think we should support the current government in implementing this IMF program, and we should support whoever wins the election and form the government in implementing the next IMF program too. So I can see another IMF program after the elections, which may be even tougher than the existing one, but it would be essential. So right now, demonizing IMF or demonizing our international multilateral partners, that won't help us. We know we are in a quandrum, and we need to get out of here. And we need to bring some of the reform, much needed reforms, which are being emphasized by IMF, and type of reforms which yesterday the Saudi finance minister also hinted upon at Davos.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Abid. Ali Fazil Saab, I'd like to move back to you again. So this future debt servicing and the pressure that we see on the forex reserves, how do you see it impacting the trade sector currently and in the future as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And first of all, I like to thank my friend Bakar, like giving us all that hope, and let's hope we move that way and we get all the flows and we avert that. But what the damage is being done. I mean, what you need to understand is that in efforts to meet our foreign debt repayment while not urging into the IMF program in 2022, there were like 3-4 times happened in that by the successive government. So I don't need to repeat all those timelines. You are well aware of it. But in order to meet the external debt repayment, we have imposed the default on the private sector, on the consumers. So we started with this LC restriction one by one, and it's expanding and all that. One by one, different industries are closing or they're operating at a certain low levels. So now what's happening as of today is in many industries in Pakistan are operating at a suboptimal level and some are closed. And the way things are in the next 2-3 months, if we don't improve the situation, and I don't see that, and I see this tapering of this LC in the next, if we go to the IMF today, and I think this tapering of this LC would take about another 6 months or so. It won't be taper off like in a day unless we get 10-15 billion tomorrow, and then we can do that, and we shouldn't be doing that. But there'll be some industries they'll shut down. Some industries will take 2-3 years to come back. Now the chemical plants, if it is shutting down, it will take 3 months to come back. Some people are laid off, and some employees would not get back to the job, and some would not. So the economy would shrink in a way. The manufacturing sector would shrink. There would be some delinquencies in the private sector. Already the banking friends talk about that there's a growing pressure of the repayment of loans coming from different businesses, and the way things are in the next 2-3 quarters, we see this with interest rate, but perhaps go further up. You would see perhaps more delinquencies coming into the private sector as well. So this will take a few years for the private sector to come out of that, and some players won't come out of that. So the damage is already done, but we need to control the damage. That's the most important thing, that should go to the IMF, build up the financing plan, and go the next IMF program, which is going to be much tougher. But I think the way we think things are, probably perhaps Pakistan has to somehow reprofile its debt, if not to restructure its debt. The ballooning payments in the next 3 years or 3 to 5 years would force you to move that path which we are doing right now. And the other thing which urgently we need is to address the core of the problem, that is to reduce the fiscal deficit. And for that, you need to your expenditures are not that high, but for that you need to perhaps increase the revenues, or you need to revisit the seventh NFC award or revisit the 18th Amendment, giving the power to the third tier, or rolling back the amount you gave to the second year for the time being in sort of emergency, and let's share the burden of subsidies with them. And the other area, which is the utmost importance for us, is the cancer of the economy, is the energy sector, especially in the power sector. To see that there are three components. I'd love you to have understand there are three components of our energy sector. One is the petroleum, the price, that the petrol and diesel, what we call mostly. And then the other is the power sector, where the electricity comes into it. And the third is the gas sector, where we provide gas directly to the for primary energy needs. So if we see this, I start with the gas sector. The prices of the gas for the domestic sector and for various other industries is very low in Pakistan, and they're used very inefficiently, and that supply has been declining, and now we diverting for the past many years. In winters, the RLNG into the domestic side, that's growing the circular debt. The gas circular debt has gone up to 1 trillion rupees around, and not 1.6 as many quote that. And this is a big pay. So we need to increase the gas prices massively. We need to allocate the gas to the more energy efficient. That's one thing we need. The other thing we need is to increase the petroleum prices. Petroleum prices in Pakistan are lower than many other economies, and in fact, perhaps it's one of the lowest in the oil importing countries. So in those countries with export, they can keep the low prices, like we kept our gas prices low when we were making ourselves, but we can't keep the gas prices when we are importing at international prices. So that's why we have to increase the petroleum prices and all that, create buffer that. And the third area is the power sector. The power sector is a very complex area, the way it's structured, that we have enhanced the capacity, and the capacity, the payment is, is in the early years, that is paid in the first 10, 12 years, while the equity paid in 25, 30 years. Then it's linked to USD, and the currency depreciation increases that, and the power tariffs are increasing. And we see that with the increase of the power tariff in last summer, the recovery of the discos have declined from 93% to somewhere about 83%. And the AT&C losses, the cumulative transmission and distribution losses, including the recovery and all that, that has increased as well. So the problem is when you increase the energy tariff, you're bound to have more losses. The other factor is that the consumption is declining as well, as people will consume less because they cannot afford the electricity at this time. So that would increase the capacity payment per unit more, and you need to further increase it. That you're getting into a problem. That you cannot have too high electricity prices. Electricity prices in Pakistan is already higher than many other countries of similar demographic, or even better than that. So we need to address the right problem. We need to address the gas problem. We need to address the petroleum problem, so we can create cushion on the power side. And the power side, the gas should be diverted to the power side, and we should create buffer from a petroleum and side, including the gas, and that buffer should go into the energy side to have an energy sector holistic plan. One thing that the other thing we need is we need to do the structured fiscal reforms, because when we go to the next IMF program, let's hope we avert this default, and let's hope we'll be able to take the private sector out of what the mess it's been going through the past 1 year or so. We need to change the structure of the economy. We need to work on the productivity of the economy. We need to work on enhancing the exports in the industry. Like I give you many examples. So I give you 5, 6 more examples. If you talk to any foreign company today, be it British American Tobacco, Nestle, Unilever, and all that, they all are facing problems in terms of Coke and Pepsi, in terms of to take the dividend out from the Pakistan. And then they're of course facing problem in terms of importing the raw material or importing certain chemical or some machinery parts which are used in the production facilities. So and some are thinking about leaving Pakistan, some are thinking about even companies like IBM. They are thinking about reducing their local operation and all that. So those things are happening now. How can you revert them? Okay, you give them. Okay, you are a company. You produce in Pakistan. You've been functioning in Pakistan for the past many decades. You operate it like world over. There must be some areas where you can export from Pakistan. There be African economies, there be ABCD economies you can export from. You export to that and link your profit repatriation to your exports. Okay, okay, you can produce 10% of your production into export. Okay, 5% or like 50% of that can be taken as like profit repatriation and all that. You need to create formula like this. So all those things are there, and you need to work on those lines, and you need to create export and you need to increase the productivity. You need to reduce the fiscal deficit. You need to tax the real estate sector. You need to tax the retailers and traders. You need to end the holy cows in this country. You need to, and Bakar Saab would know better than if you when you dissect the fiscal side, the federal fiscal side expenditure. There are hidden expenditure going to certain areas of the economy, and you need to see that why we need to give those. So that then, when you dissect the economy, the rent seeking is going into certain areas and certain government or government associated establishments that they are running into that. And you need to unwind that. You need to unwind what's been happening in the past 75 years. If you really want to come out of that, it takes a lot of courage for people at STPI to say that, but inherently I know that they meant it as well. You have to unwind it, you have to structure it, you have to run on the private sector, you have to run on the productivity, and you have and these holy cows from the economy to work on that. And that's the way into it. I mean, you have the Vakasa told us about this, the path to the end out of this short-term problem, but 2 years down the road, we'll have the same problem. 3 years down the road, we have the same problem. We have to end it. And then the Bakasa told us about this that we long the problem, we accumulate the debt. So that's why we probably have to take a higher pain and negotiate on that and say that, okay, these are the mistakes we made in this. Okay, the next 10 years, these are the plans. We'll build on that, we work on that, and come and support us and then convert those debt into investment or something and work with us to take us out of that. We need to do that path, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for the next generation to live in this.
Right. Thank you very much, Ali Khizr Saab. And I'm just going to pick up from what you said, that the industry was affected quite a lot from this current crisis that we're facing. And primarily those industries that were heavily dependent on imported raw material for their production and manufacturing. And also the problem with the energy sector as well, the power sector, etc. So in a way, I mean, this can be called a low growth phase. So Dr. Akhtas, I'd like to request you to please come in and let us know that in this low growth phase, do you see any opportunities for Pakistan and how it can sort of reinvent itself?
Thank you very much. I've been listening to all the comments that have been made here. The first thing that I want to say is that there is a lot of emphasis here being placed on, why shouldn't Pakistan have a market-determined exchange rate? I guess the experience since October has now indicated that it is almost impossible for Pakistan to not have a market-determined exchange rate regime, because we simply do not have the kind of foreign exchange reserves that we can use to, play in the foreign exchange market. But I think there is, so having said this, I mean, I do understand that we cannot play that game, but we have to think about what is going to happen once Pakistan moves towards a market-determined exchange rate. I mean, we are looking at the Pak rupee sliding almost another, 20%, 15 to 20%. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to unleash another round of extremely high inflation. Now, this is going to come on top of inflation that has been at 25% in the past 1 year. That going to bring about in poverty in Pakistan already where it is very easy to keep harping about that Pakistan should have a market determined exchange rate. I think we need to understand why is it that certain professionals, policymakers, or governments are trying to maintain Pakistan rupee at where it has been, and it's there, they've been trying to do it. So it is definitely going to bring about a consumption crisis. And I think we don't have a choice. We have to listen to the IMF because it is the lender of last resort. And we need the IMF right now. But that does not mean that the relationship between the IMF and Pakistan is a relationship of equals. It is a political relationship. It is a relationship between a lender and a borrower. And invariably, it is going to involve bargaining and negotiation. So I think we'll see how Pakistani government is able to do that in the months to come, and what kind of leverage it is going to be able to apply on the IMF. So I just wanted to talk about the fact that where it now appears almost so, it's so evident that Pakistan should have a market determined exchange rate. There is also a rationale when people try to prevent the exchange rate from sliding, because a lot of the inflation that has happened in Pakistan has happened because of this problems with the exchange rate or the depreciation of the exchanges. Now, to answer your question that we are definitely in a low growth phase, and what can Pakistan do? Well, here a lot of people have talked about focusing on exports, having an export orientation, what have you. I completely agree with it, but I think at some point we are going to have to sit down and think about that. Why has Pakistan not been able to increase its exports substantially in the last few years, in the last 10 years, or last 15 years for that matter? And mind you, one of the reasons why our exports are not increasing has to do with the overall depreciation against the US dollar, because every time the US dollar depreciates, it reduces the value of our exports in dollar terms. So where the rupee quantum of our exports has gone up significantly, in dollar terms, it doesn't go up as much because the rupee loses value against dollar. I mean, if the dollar was somehow miraculously to go back to 100 rupees, our exports would immediately double. So, I mean, we also have to understand that, when you depreciate, it impacts your current account situation. The other issue with the exchange rate is, and I think somebody did mention this, that a lot of our exports have significant imported component. So whenever we let our exchange rate depreciate, which causes second round impact with inflation, instead of increasing exports, it makes our exports more expensive. So having gone from 100 rupees to a dollar to now upwards of 230 or wherever that rate is, the market rate of dollar, it has not really doubled our exports. So, I mean, it's a very problematic situation. And if you were to ask me, I would have tried to prevent the slide of Pakistani rupee against the US dollar. But like I said, we don't have that option. But if we had a lot of foreign exchange reserves, I would have liked to prevent Pakistan's rupee where it is right now, or even lower than this. So getting back to this point about why Pakistani exports have not increased over the last many years, I think there are a number of reasons, but I think there are some non-economic reasons behind that as well. So obviously there is a policy architecture, so I talked about going for tariff reforms. The kind of tariffs that we have, they create a system of disincentives for local manufacturers to think about exporting abroad. So that's one part. But I think if you look at Pakistan's human capital, I mean, if you look at the scores that our students are getting in math and reading versus the rest of the world, if you look at the average years of schooling that an average Pakistani labor has, I think we pale in comparison to our competitors. So let me give you those numbers. So an average Pakistani worker has 2.5 to 3.5 years of schooling. When we compare that with India, it has about 7 to 8 years of schooling, and South Korea has about 12 plus years of median years of schooling. So I think if we are serious about increasing the amount of our exports, we are going to have to make very, very huge, sustained, and continuous investments in our human capital, which means that we are going to have one of the, not the best, but at least a competitive system of education versus the rest of the world, so that when our labor force is trying to produce something, they are able to actually read manuals, get the training, and produce the value added that is going to give you more foreign exchange earning. So I think those are some of the points that I wanted to make. And I would just now, listen to some of the other panelists who are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Afzal. Absolutely. Investing in human capital is definitely the long-term solution to our problems and for achieving economic independence as well. So you mentioned that, it's very important to address the IMF's concerns that they have regarding our fiscal prudence. And in that context, it's very important to bear in mind that fiscal consolidation is quite important. And Dr. Waqar, you mentioned earlier how you have certain recommendations regarding that. So if you could please share them with our esteemed participants and panelists.
Thank you. I think the fiscal consolidation path is extremely important, given that one of the largest component. In fact, going forward, the major concern on the fiscal side would be debt servicing. And the debt servicing component has increased to a point where it is going to take drastic steps now, not just for 1 year, not just for 2 years, but probably a decade and a half before we come to a level which is called sustainably manageable. So in that respect, I think, and I do understand that the government is looking into it, but again, going back to the opportunity part, this government now has that opportunity which comes probably after 7 to 8 years of maybe a decade in this country, where you now have control over fiscal systems in the provinces as well, at least in the 3 provinces where you have control. So many of those things that you weren't able to do, they are now looking into it to do that. For example, harmonization of tax system, particularly the GST harmonization. Now, of course, we are hearing from the federal government, from the finance ministry, from FBR, that yes, now there is a small narrow window of a couple of months before the budget and maybe after the budget as well, when they would have maybe caretaker setups in the provinces, but of course they would be able to exercise some of the powers which they weren't able to do on the provincial revenue authorities to bring GST into a structure which we can call harmonized. Now, GST harmonization not only brings in additional revenues for Federation as a whole, but it also contributes to its ease of doing business, which in turn will have the second round impact on higher contribution towards higher GDP, higher growth. That's one. The second problem, I think there is still room for looking into innovative ways of targeting. As I said in one of the previous seminars at SDPI today, before this seminar, that you still have hidden and cross subsidies in your essential items. So somebody not needing a subsidy on ghee or wheat or other essentials still ends up getting it because there are issues with targeting, you might as well use the same amount more efficiently, of course, and then, of course, use the BISP, NADRA, and the provincial social protection registries to have some unique identification, which is not impossible now given the artificial intelligence which NADRA has started to use, It's just that somebody has to give that role to them. And some brainstorming will go into it, but the same amount can be used efficiently. Don't pass it on as an untargeted subsidy for ghee, oil, electricity, gas, power. Just give it through a mechanism which, of course, is still not fully refined, but we can make it refined, and there are savings from there as well. Now, currently, as I see it, and that would be my final point, if you look at the current ongoing quarter, FBR is facing a tax shortfall of somewhere around 200 billion rupees, And even for this quarter as well, despite the low economic growth, they will need ideas to tap into the parallel economy, the undocumented part of the economy, the two key sectors which have significant contribution to GDP, but are not being tapped enough. One being the transport and communication sector, and the second is wholesale and retail and trade sector. They will have to, of course, take on some measures, carrot or stick, to bring these two sectors under the tax net. What they could do is probably go back to the 2017 tax code. 2017 tax code had many of those things that were probably measures which one takes in emergency times. There were still measures which were progressive, maybe. There were still measures which, in the absence of a full-fledged wealth taxation in the country, still were able to bring super profits into the tax net. And going back to the 2017 code would also, of course, bring some further corporate incomes as well into the tax net, including the dividends of those companies. Last but not the least, as I said, emergency times call for emergency measures. How about brainstorming that? What are those? And we don't talk about this much, which is privatization, selling off of government assets. Just because we think that whenever we talk about privatizing, anything that we talk about would become political. But these are emergency times. I think once again we are standing at a point where we need to open the debate that why does it take so long to even dispose of something on face value, despite of fully knowing that it is hemorrhaging the system, leading to a huge losses, So I think it's time, and there are, of course, legal ways to short circuit privatization of at least assets on which there is consensus, even if they lend you less money, they would at least lessen the cost being incurred by the exchequer, which is what we require under the fiscal consolidation plan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waqar. So that brings me to the end of the second round. And just to wrap up the discussion, I'd just like to ask all of my panelists here that what do you feel is your single most important advice for the sitting government as of now? Perhaps, Dr. Aghdis, I could start with you as you have to leave.
Ji, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar and for putting up such brilliant questions. My abiding advice to this administration, to the government, and to the people of this country is, we've had a very, very horrible year, both in terms of the political instability, the economic crisis, and then a climate crisis. So we essentially went through a year of poly crisis, which is still very much with us. And I think whenever a system, a country, or a society suffers from a crisis of the magnitude that we have suffered in the last year, it's the most vulnerable sections of society that end up paying the highest price or bear the highest cost. So my advice and my appeal and my request to the government is that we must look at enhancing the stipends that are being given under BISP. We need to take it to BISP plus, meaning that the BISP loan officers, or whatever you want to call them, case officers, when they visit certain households and they see that these households probably have a pregnant female, it should automatically plug into the lady health worker network. or they should, make it conditional on getting vaccination. So we have to really enhance the BISP network that we have, because it's the only direct access that this government has with the people of this country, the poor people of this country. So I think that's one. They have to increase the stipends that are being given. And that is also very important, because now Pakistan's economy and society can no longer postpone um, the very important process of reforms. And some very deep and some very important reforms are now required in your tax system, in the privatization of your state-owned enterprises, in your tariff structures. And that process is only going to have ownership, and it's only going to become sustainable if you can ensure that this reform process is not going to bring about more pain and social unrest in Pakistan. Because Pakistan, if there's one thing that we cannot have right now in this country, that is widespread social and political unrest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Afzal. And I'd like to say goodbye to you as well, because you mentioned you have to leave. So, Dr. Abid, next I'd like to request you for your single most important advice to the city government.
Thank you. I think even if we go to IMF, if we complete this ninth review of IMF, it would be just a first rate treatment to a big hemorrhage. It would provide us relief for in the short term, but in the medium to long terms, I endorse what other panelists they have said. So endorsing Waqar's suggestion of targeting subsidies and Akhtar's suggestions of enhancing social protection, my advice to the government would be that instead of being apologetic in implementing the IMF program, rather it should be part of all political parties as part of their election manifesto, that how will they be taking care of the black holes in our economy, so that they can actually get over and done with it in a single go. So people, they have suffered a lot. They are ready to perhaps suffer, and they can foresee that they will be suffering for at least another year or so due to global as well as our domestic circumstances. But I think we should, and as the global partners, they are now asking for reforms as well. So we need to admit that the free flow of dollar that we have seen during two Afghan conflicts, that is over. We should admit that we need to take care of reforms as part of the government's election manifesto. And while doing these reforms, we have to be cautious of how to take care of those who fall in low and lower middle income brackets. And I hope that if a sensible debate can be initiated on it, both the government as well as the opposition political parties, they will understand the urgency of it. They would only be able to do the politics if economy sustains. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abid. Ali Khizr Saab, perhaps you could share your advice next.
Sorry.
Okay. The first thing is, like, for this government to immediately need to is to go back to the IMF and complete this review before it's too late. Because if you don't get back to the IMF, then we are forced to fall on it, which is very risky. And things would be very difficult. And we've seen what happened in the Sri Lanka in the last year. And then I don't want to say, but things can go south. Really south, and of course we need to do this direct subsidy to the most vulnerable sector through the ISP program and all that. Of course, that. And how we need to do to the IMF review as of now, there are government, as Waqar Saab is very close to the government, and he's saying that the government is working on it, so I'm glad to know that. I think the topmost board of contention between Pakistan and IMF at this point of time is running to exchange market. So we need to have that flexible exchange rate that's there, but I don't see that if you move the exchange into market-based, this would make us to the level of 290 or something, as many people are saying, or something. To me, if we leave it today, I give you a plan to do that. Okay, there are 4 conditions of the IMF: exchange rate, one market, second is the inspection in the fiscal deficit, third is the inspection in the circular debt, and fourth is the commitment from the friends. And the commitment of friend is action. Then the next program, what would happen then?
Be 2 trillion rupees. And because of this 172 or maybe 280 price, there would be huge increase in the balance of payment obligation. It means that for the next 3 years, 2.2% if it is growth would be shaved off. 3 to 5 years, there would be negative growth and a loss of jobs. What does
Close the session on time and we have people online. $2 trillion. But one has to really exercise that political will, and I'm not talking about hard full stops. You can
do that gradually, so that none of the economic agents start to feel the pain. Tahir Sahib, your question is very important. And it's not just about policy, it's also about the administration part of the economy. It's been 2.5 weeks since it was identified that there was dollar smuggling taking place to Afghanistan and Iran